let's start by your question.
Okay. Well, we were off camera for a second. My question was that nowadays in corporate America, there's always a possibility that you could lose your job any minute. That's because that's just the nature of it. Like we were talking about in the Midwest, so many people have lost their jobs in the last 10 years, where those jobs had been there for several generations.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we've come to a point now where the corporation and the shareholders and things like that, their bottom line is more important than the worker.
Yeah.
And
Well-
I know people in the old days, obviously the owners of the businesses and the employers and things like that, I know they have always been interested in the bottom line, but it seems like maybe the worker was not the lowest common
No,
denominator.
I think they were. I think they were. They were laid off. Whenever there was a slump in business and so forth, they were laid off. And there was no unemployment compensation either.
Right.
Which made it very bad. When you laid off, you really pulled in your belt. And so that hasn't changed. However, the attitude of the worker, on the other hand, years ago, and their hopes, was to get a good job, doing something they like to do in a plant, and then spend their whole life working there, and end up with a pension. That was one of the things that was pretty general in those days. You got a pension if you worked 20, 30 years or whatever it was. Of course, that's true now, but now their pensions back there were pretty solid. They got them. But in more recent years now, with these companies all merging and everything else, and lines being crossed and people being laid off and everything else, there's some doubt as to whether they will actually get their money.
Well,
Some of it or any of it.
And people change jobs so often.
That's
too
right. I mean,
nowadays.
there's no such thing as a pension. There's some movement comes up from time to time. I don't know what the situation is at the moment, but that a person's pension can follow with him. I mean, a guy earns $500 worth of pension over here and goes to this company. He starts with $500 here. Now, who's taking care of all that bookkeeping and everything else for each one of these people? I have no idea. I don't know how that's going to work out.
Right.
So I'm more inclined to think that if you move around a lot, don't depend on a pension. I don't know. But
Well, maybe just to finish this train of thought. You mentioned how tough it was for the worker then, and now things are better, but at the same time there's always, well, like you said, it's cyclical. It's still.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, the thing
do
is,
you see any other glaring examples of differences between the average working Joe back in the 20s and like pre-depression versus now?
oh, I think there's all kinds of difference. I don't think there's anybody alive today that would want to go back there and work under the circumstances that they did there. Safety, for example, the safety was not a great problem. You worked into a plant and you worked on some sort of a punch press or something like that, where any wrong move you could lose a part of your hand or something like that. They had no safety devices. Now, if you work in something like that, the minute the thing comes down that draws your hand, you have something on your arms and it's connected with so that when that machine comes down, your hands are pulled away. So you can't, safety, things like that, they're all over the place in plants these days, in almost every circumstances. And the handling equipment, mechanically they move stuff. They don't do it with muscles.
Right.
They do it with mechanical means like forklifts and everything else. And I mentioned before about raising up the cement blocks, and now so the difference is phenomenal. I mean, if somebody that worked back in 1920 were to miraculously come alive and take a look at the circumstances under what the same guy does now. Carpenter, for example, every board they sawed by hand. Every board, everything. Now they go like that, or put it on a table saw, you know, and cut long lengths, and have hand power-driven nail hammer, zing, 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 punching. Those things would just seem miraculous to people that worked
Yeah.
in those days.
Which brings a thought to my mind, which I'd like to ask you about. You've also, well, when you're just talking about that, the fact that they had to do every single board, there's also, tell me what the difference is between building houses then and building houses now, in the fact that I see old houses circa the teens and 20s, that era, and I think they're gorgeous and they're all unique and they just seem great. And now you go to these new subdivisions and they make every single house exactly the same,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
stucco and tile and
Well, they never
there's
made-
no
I think the main difference there, years ago, they didn't make whole messes of houses. See, now we're in a rather nice area here, but if you look around here, you'll find out there's probably about 6 different styles of houses, and that's all there are in here.
right.
And some of them are like this one that's got the living room over there, but 2 doors away is the same house, but flopped with the living room over here. And but otherwise, it's exactly the same. So, in order to keep the construction costs down, they make multiples
Right,
of any one thing. Where years ago, everything was a custom-built house.
right. But how do you feel about that?
Well, they were much better, but our economy wouldn't. You couldn't do it anymore. If you wanted a custom-built house like this now, and this is not an expensive house, comparative. It would probably to build this house today on a custom basis, new plans, new everything. It would probably cost at least 3 times what this cost, because this was done on a mass production deal
Right.
with plans that went for where one set of plans would be the same for maybe 200 houses, depending on the size of the development. But every one of those would be individual, and that's the way those houses were built, that one individual owner, one individual house.
Well, you mentioned that, didn't it cost, I mean, you say now it's not economically viable. Why would it have been more so back then? I mean, wasn't money scarcer?
Well, no,
then?
you're right. You're right. Under the cost would be less then, but also the income was less. So the comparative between the two is about the same. But we are getting so much more in the house now than they used to have. You'd get the 4 walls, the windows, the doors, and floors, of course. Today, you've got electricity into the house. Of course, I don't know whether, well, back in the 20s they were putting electrical wiring in. But electrical wiring was a much simpler process to put in than it is now. And so it was with everything. The plumbing, let's see, how about the plumbing? Well, they didn't have as much of it. They only had 1 bathroom, for example, where most of the houses now have 2,
Right.
sometimes 3. And you got all the ductwork for heating and ventilating. You got air conditioning now, which you didn't have then. Fans in the ceiling. And a variety of other things that are added to it now that add to the cost. Now, if you take all of these items out that are now in our house that were not in the house then, it would bring the cost of this down appreciably. If they just were the 4 walls, doors, and
Right.
windows, and so on. So perhaps the difference would be in the extras that are on it.
Right. Well, personally, I see it as less craftsmanship nowadays than back then. And not only in houses and things like that, but in a lot of
Oh,
things.
that's
in
another thing,
clothing
yeah.
and shoes and
Yeah.
cars
Well,
even.
I don't know whether it's less craftsmanship. Uh, I think the things that we get now are better craftsmanship. Automobiles, for example. I mean, in the old days, the old Model Ts, which were very simple automobiles as compared to the complexities of these modern things that we drive. But nevertheless, you'd have to clean carbon off the pistons about once every 6 months, and you had to set the pins. You had to, I don't know anything about mechanics, but you had, I can remember from personal experience, you were tearing that car apart every month or so to do something to it. Where, geez, now you buy a car like me, I buy one of those Hondas there, and I could drive it for 3 years without doing anything but putting oil in it and gas. So you can't squawk about that kind of quality.
Yeah, well, that's technology.
Yeah,
I
well,
think
that's
more
technology.
so than
Yeah,
craftsmanship.
that's right, it's technology.
But
well,
we'll stick. I've been things like everyday things, clothing, houses.
Well, I
there's
think- I
a
think
big difference. I think
clothing
I
is
mean,
better now too, but it's there it is. It's technology, and that is that you've got thread, for example, used to be cotton, and now it's nylon or some sort of a plastic
Yeah.
thing like that, which is strength is phenomenal next to threads. Threads could go, you'd be losing your buttons all the time because the thread would wear out. And from that standpoint, the clothes is better off than it was back then. There's a lot to be said for our modern living. there's the old saw about the good old days is due in some respects. I mentioned one of them was the camaraderie that was developed as a result of poor circumstances. And
Yeah.
that was, we don't have that at all. The
The
neighborliness
sense of
we don't
community.
have. Sense of community. We don't have anything like that. We don't have the patriotism anymore. There's so many things we don't have now that we had that makes that the good old days. But when it comes to technologies and goods and merchandise and things like that, I think we got the best now that we've ever had. That it's getting better.
Yeah.
Is that disappointing to you?
No, not at all. Not at all. I just, I see. Well, you think of things nostalgically. I mean, obviously I didn't live
Yeah.
through that time,
Yeah.
but you still think of things nostalgically.
Well,
and I
that's
see
true. I do
things
too.
from that time, and maybe my point is that the things I see from the 20s, like the houses and things like that I love, that are from that era, maybe I feel like they're so nice, and they were that way back then because they were built so nice, and that's why they still are standing. And maybe they had houses that weren't as nice as the ones that are still standing. You know what I mean? And then they're just not
Well,
here anymore.
they're
and so
structurally, those houses are probably better than, well, particularly frame houses, because frame houses have a tendency to deteriorate as against concrete, for example. But in those days, when they called it 2x4, it was actually 2 inches by 4 inches. Now a 2x4 is 1.5 by 3.5. So you got that much more lumber going for you. And furthermore, they did build structurally. They were very well built houses. But the thing is, they're missing a lot of things. They had no insulation in them. They just and we put insulation all through the ceilings and everything else. We put it in all the walls, and now there's a double insulation. The new houses are putting still more insulation than they are. It used to be 4 inches, now it's 6 inches. And then in addition to that, if you look at the new houses, you'll see a batting, which is an insulation that's put on the outside. You see the big names down the side? That's another type of insulation, which is added to it instead. See, so everything is improving, and it's becoming more expensive as a result.
Yeah.
But like I say, all you got with the walls and the ceilings, the roof, and
Yeah.
that was it.
Yeah. You just, I guess my thing is just you think of things if they were, you think of them as being, if they're handmade, individually made, rather, I
They're
mean,
better.
it's like, yeah, that you'd think that they're better, but I guess technology has compensated for the
Yeah.
fact that they're,
Yeah.
well, I guess technology is what's made them so you don't have to make them handmade anymore.
No, that's
and
right.
Technology also compensates for the fact
Yeah.
that there's not the human quality, doing it. Do you know what I mean? And all of this came from the fact that you said they have to cut every single board
Yeah.
by hand when they're building a house, and it just made me think, well, maybe that's why those houses from that era seem so much better than what they have now, because they had to do it they just had to put so much into every little detail that
Yeah.
it comes out in. I mean, I see that when I see a house from that era.
Yeah, but then you can look at it the other way. You can take and say a guy had to have a real tight fit on a board that's 4 feet long, and he sawed it a little crooked, and gets it up there and find out a little crooked. It's unlikely he's going to come down and do another one. he's going to compensate, put an extra nail in it up there or something like that. So I don't know whether it necessarily gives you a better quality thing if you do hand do everything, because hand done things are hard to duplicate. Where you can mass produce something and have them all clones of each other all the way down the line, so that and that's particularly true in mechanics and things like that. I mean, when they make pistons for cars, those pistons have got to be true, one to the other by 1/32nd of an inch or something
Right.
like that. What am I saying? 1/3200th of an inch.
Yeah.
And mass producing them is about the only way you can do that.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's all. I just, you just get that old, like you say, the old day feeling, where
Everything was better.
Yeah, you just tend to
Yeah.
think that
Well,
way because of the
you know what I
different
think
things.
the
but-
reason that is because most people, and particularly me, and I think perhaps you as well, look back at the old days, that is when your younger years, as being delightful. And so consequently that rubs off on everything that you touched, everything you used, and everything you experienced, and everything that you worked with was part of that delightful view that you have of. So that stuff, as bad as it might be, still rides along in your mind as being something that's
Right.
unusual. And I can remember my granddad's first truck, for example. He had an all-American truck, which came and went in a matter of about 5 years, the company.
Yeah.
Back in those days, there were all kinds of truck companies and all kinds of automobile companies starting up, and they'd flop and fall, and finally we got what we got today. But anyhow, that all-American truck, it was new to me. He had had a horse prior to that, and that truck was the first truck we ever had in the family. In fact, I think it was the first car we had in the family. And boy, it had to crank it up, and it bump, 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 and run, 4 cylinders, and we were listening to 1 cylinder on his cement mixer. Was the only other engine we ever heard around there, and that was the 1 cylinder. So this sounded delightful, and anyhow, it would take us all the way out to the country, out to Larson's Farm, for example, which was about 10 miles out in the country, and all the way back, much faster than the horse and buggy and everything else. It got us there, and all we had to do was put gas in this thing, and it'd do this. And so consequently, I thought there's nothing in the world better than this truck. And perhaps at that time there wasn't, but I'm still remembering that as a great thing,
Yeah.
which adds to the fact that everything else was so great in my youth.
Right. Did you ever hear your parents or your grandparents talking about the old days for them?
Oh yes, I think that goes on infinitum, backwards.
What would they say about what, like,
The good old days.
yeah, what was the good old days to them? Do you
Well-
remember specifics?
I think one of the
The
things.
Civil War?
Well, that my granddad was, I think, he'd born in '60, which was just ahead of the Civil War. Grandpa Franz. No, I never heard him say anything about Civil War, but I do remember him saying the good old days, and I don't know what they were talking about, but I can imagine what they talked about, and I think it was the sociability of people, the willingness to help each other, because back in those days, and it was the conditions of the times that caused them to do it, because they were living out in the back there, the '60s, 1860s, and so forth. They were living out in the country, most of them. Towns were just little tiny things, and even whether a town
Especially
or country.
the Mississippi River
Yeah.
is the end of the line.
That's right.
I mean,
It was
anything
just
west
about the end of
was
the line.
that was
Yeah.
it, right?
But anyhow, they had to cut the trees down. They did everything from scratch, and so neighbors helped. All the neighbors helped the Johnsons over here to build their place, because the Johnsons in turn would be part of those people that would come over and help these. They helped each other, and that carried on. Well, it carried on up until the 20s or so, and the people would do that, and then pretty soon they started having regular contractors and so forth. They lived in places where they were available. But anyhow, it reminded me that harvesting, for example, up until probably the 50s, maybe it's still going on. I'm not familiar with it. But the harvesting, the farmers would all go to one place and with all their equipment and do the Jones farm, and then they'd come over here and do the Smith farm. And everybody worked together to do everybody's farm, see? So that sort of cooperation extends back a long, long way. And so consequently, my grandfolks, when they talk about the good old days, are probably talking about the good old days when they had the barn racing.
Mm-hmm.
And all the family got together and they had the picnics and they danced and they raised the farm and all the buildings and everything. They made a party out
It
of
wasn't
it,
like
you know.
that anymore when you were around, because
No.
now they have a contractor.
That's
to
right.
do it. And
So
it wasn't
anyhow,
the
that
good
was
old
the
days
good old
anymore.
days. So
See, and you talk about how sociable people were when you were growing up,
yeah,
and your parents and grandparents thought people were more sociable
that's right.
even before that.
I think that's the same way.
Maybe because of the city, because now people were in the city and it was
Mhm.
different than being in the country.
Yeah.
Do you think? That's a question.
Well, the city was less of that than in the country, but nevertheless, even in the city there was that helpfulness and friendliness and across the back fence conversations and gossip and all that going on. So that was the good old days. And it's the same way with us. I mean, right now, I look back at those, I call them the good old days. And what it is the friendliness, the camaraderie between people is what we're talking about.
Right.
The camaraderie between those that were raising the barn. The camaraderie between all the way along the line. And that's the part that we miss.
Right.
Like now, I mean, I'm kind of a social individual, and I miss the neighborliness that we should have.
Yeah.
And I'm as much to blame as the other, because I'm as interested as they're probably as interested in getting together as I am, but we never find the time. The opportunity isn't right. It takes some guy with enough backbone to say, look, I'm going to get the neighbors together and we're going to have a picnic out in the yard, out in the front, you know. Somebody like that is the only one is an absolute necessity to get people like us these days together.
Right. And I grew up in a small town, so I was lucky enough to have a similar experience growing up as far as the camaraderie of the neighborhood. And
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up with the neighborhood kids, and everybody, you know, we were more spread out than
Yeah.
in the city, but there was a lot of helping going on, and everybody knew everybody, and